The British had failed on 3 occasions to conquer Afghanistan. Nobody had ever done it. This is where they didn't look at history.
I thought that this was a war that will not only destroy Afghanistan, but basically the Soviet Union.
What were we doing there? What were we fighting for? Why did my friends die? No one knows why.
This is Moscow, the heart of what was once the Soviet Union. If nations are forged by wars, then the USSR was tempered in the fires of World War II. The scale of the conflict is difficult to imagine. At least 20 million Soviets died fighting the Nazis. Soviet children were raised on stories of their parents' and their grandparents' bravery in World War II. Vicious battles were turned into simple moral tales. The heroes were communists, the villains were Nazis. Good triumphed over evil. Now communism is gone, but veterans of the Second World War still hold an honored place in Russian society. But few praise the soldiers who fought in the USSR's next and final war. This small building contains one of 2 museums in Russia devoted to the internationalist war, known to the West as the war in Afghanistan. The museum is actually a 2-room apartment in a bad neighborhood. Sergei Bogomolov and Nikolai Eliseev were both 18 when they were sent to Afghanistan, typical of the conscripts who fought this 10-year war. They were told they were fulfilling their patriotic duty to their motherland. So, like many others, they served 2-year tours in what has been called the Soviet Vietnam. They returned home battle-weary and disillusioned. Now, many of their countrymen call them murderers.
Babach.
The war started December 26, 1979, when the Soviet 40th Army invaded Afghanistan. Under the guise of support for the nation's year-old socialist government, the Soviets captured the capital city of Kabul and put a puppet leader into power. The Soviets' primary mission was to crush the growing Muslim fundamentalist movement. Officially, the 40th Army advised the Afghan army, much as the United States advised South Vietnam in the 1960s. Afghanistan lies south of the Soviet Union, next to Iran and Pakistan. The country is ringed by mountain ranges, a natural advantage that protected the Afghanis from invasion for centuries. In the first month of the war, more than 50,000 soldiers poured through the Salang Pass into Afghanistan. Over the next 10 years, at least 500,000 others would follow.
Everyone in '79 told us that we would be defending our southern borders. From whom? That's a difficult question. It's fully possible that at that time they told us it was from you. That is, from the Americans.
The Soviets rolled into Afghanistan with heavy armor, including T-62 and T-72 tanks. But like Soviet tactics, these tanks were designed for European cities and forests. The T-72's suspension fell apart on Afghanistan's rocky terrain. T-62s and T-55s became the tanks of choice.
In general, the use of tanks in combat operations in Afghanistan was not effective. was not effective. Because tanks need a great deal of space for maneuvering, gaining speed, outflanking. But there, at a given moment, you'd be driving along narrow roads and come to a stop. It would be very easy to set a tank on fire with grenade launchers or other types of anti-tank weapons.
The Soviets' enemies were a loosely organized band of mountain tribesmen and mercenary soldiers who called themselves the Mujahideen, soldiers of God. They planned to inflict the death of 1,000 cuts on the Soviet and Afghan armies through small terrorist strikes.
We were 6 tanks entering the gorge. It was the tactic of the Mujahideen to first explode the tanks with the mines, then to rocket the tanks from the high points on the mountains. When a mine exploded under my tank, I knew the next thing would be rockets coming toward me. I ordered my men, my 4 men in the tank, to jump out before the rockets came. I got out of the tank, but 2 men were still inside when the rockets hit it. Those 2 people died. The 3rd man died outside the tank. I received shrapnel wounds in my leg. The Mujahideen destroyed my tanks. The Mujahideen killed my friends, and the Mujahideen injured me. That was the most important day of my life. The second most important was the day I joined the Mujahideen.
Here, there were entirely different tactics. One of the things we had to deal with, one of our problems, was to locate the enemy quickly, to determine quickly where the gunfire was coming from. It was particularly difficult in the beginning to get used to the mountains, because the echo, the acoustics, you got the sense that the gunfire was coming from all sides.
It was very difficult to tell a guerrilla from a simple Afghan civilian. It was very difficult. They would in their own way stand out a little bit, but to pick them out just like that was impossible. You're driving along and someone shoots at you. You begin looking around and you see a guy who's just digging in his yard. He's got a shovel in his hands, he's just digging in his yard, but if you look closely, you'll find a rifle lying nearby.
The Soviets seized Afghanistan cities and took control of the country's infrastructure. Theoretically, the nation was theirs, but in reality, they never had it.
The very sort of factional and decentralized nature of Afghanistan is part of what made it so impossible for the Soviet Union to conquer. This is where they didn't look at history. This is where they failed to recognize that the British had failed on 3 occasions to conquer Afghanistan, that nobody had ever done it. And in large part because Afghanistan is such a decentralized and, in a sense, factionalized country. Controlling the cities in Afghanistan means nothing. It doesn't mean that you control the country. In actual fact, what it does is it makes you a prisoner of those towns and of those roads. They were prisoners of their own tanks and their own armor, in a sense.
In the early years of the Afghan war, the Soviet army learned that its large mechanized forces would never engage the Mujahideen in a conventional battle. So the Soviets began adopting their enemy's tactics. These small hit-and-run ambushes were successful, but they made no real difference. The Mujahideen knew their terrain far better than the Soviets ever could, yet many troops felt safer on foot than in armored vehicles.
For the infantry, even in the mountains, there is at least a chance that you might save your skin under fire. You can jump behind some rock, you can find cover. But for a driver in an APC or a tank crew, there were many times when they were blown up, blown to bits. You'd be driving along and you can't tell if the road was mined or not. Because the Afghans did very clever things. There would be an ordinary plank lying on the road. On the underside of it would be electrical contacts. You'd go over it, and about 150 meters from the road, somewhere in the bushes, amidst the brush, there would be a missile launcher. Your wheels would run over it, they'd trigger the contacts, and the missile would take off and arrive on target.
The resistance became very adept at laying mines, at setting traps, at setting explosives. They became excellent at it by any standards. There was one point where they were laying a tank, anti-tank mines underneath where there had been tank tracks before, and then once they dug it out, they carried away the dirt. They put the mine in its place, they put more dirt down, and then with a little pencils and sticks, they recreated the tank tracks over the top of the mine, so that the natural thing for the next tank that came along was to go in the tracks of the tank that had come before. So if they did that, they were in for a surprise.
The thing about combat is that if the enemy is watching and a vehicle approaches unaware, he is able to fix his sights with his grenade launcher. But if at that very moment I turn my guns on him, even if I don't shoot, don't you think the guy's heart is already in his throat? He sighted the target, but he didn't shoot. Didn't shoot what he targeted. You understand why I do that? I won't even shoot, just drive along and dramatically swing the guns around towards those areas, moving them back and forth.
With ground operations failing, the Soviets brought in their most effective weapon of the war, helicopter gunships. These almost turned the tide until the mid-80s, when the United States gave the resistance Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. Stingers forced helicopters to keep their distance, returning the focus back to ground warfare. But the Soviets were determined to keep up the pressure on the Mujahideen, particularly on the forces led by Ahmad Shah Massoud, also known as the Lion of Panjshir.
The Soviets sent 20,000 troops at a time up the Panjshir Valley. On 9 occasions, there were 9 major Panjshir offensives, all with tanks and with armor, all with air cover. Every single time they were defeated and pushed back by what may have been at that point 2,000 to 3,000 resistance fighters, Mujahideen. It was a classic example of the wrong armor being used in the wrong environment.
You could win that war on one condition. If we were to send in huge military forces, and these forces would have neutralized all resistance, then you could win. But we couldn't do that. I'll tell you why. Because those so-called flying detachments are what we called the counter-revolutionary detachments. They spread themselves out among the people in the villages. And in order to liquidate such a detachment, you would have to blow up or bomb the village or destroy it with tanks. We couldn't do that, because that was the civilian population.
The fact is that the Soviets were very much part of the action when they would so-called supposedly liberate a village and tell that to widows and the millions of maimed people. Remember always that 1.5 million people were killed in the Afghan war, and it wasn't by the Afghan army. Most of those people were killed by the Soviets, and that just can't be forgotten.
В Афганистане, в черном тюльпане, с водкой в стакане мы молча плывем над землей.
For 5 years, the Soviet people were told the Red Army was sent to Afghanistan to build schools and plant trees. But by 1986, the number of dead teenagers buried in unmarked graves was too great to hide. Morale had deteriorated to the point where folk songs were written about soldiers being carried home in body bags.
I've seen eyes on young faces, eyes that should belong to very old people. Those kids, what they saw in Afghanistan was, as I said, beyond normal human experience. And this was reflected in their eyes.
We were sent there as kids, 18 years old. We haven't seen much in our lives. We landed in an entirely different world, and suddenly, 1 minute you would be talking with your closest friend, a half hour later, you had lunch together, but you may never have dinner with him again.
In 1986, the USSR's new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, decided to slowly withdraw Soviet troops from Afghanistan. The retreat had to be gradual, or it would be seen for what it really was, the first Soviet admission that a communist revolution had failed. And worse, the victors were the warriors of Islam. The Soviets had economic and strategic reasons for invading Afghanistan, but a central goal was far more sweeping. They wanted to stop the spread of what they considered Islamic extremism. In fact, the decision to invade seems to have been triggered by a 1979 riot in the city of Herat. The socialist government had launched a campaign to teach Afghan women how to read. This outraged religious conservatives. Rioters broke into a Soviet compound and beheaded dozens of Russians and their families. The Kremlin drafted its invasion plans soon after. The Soviets always claimed that the momentum of history was on their side, but history had made other plans.
When the Soviet Union left Afghanistan, they were determined not to repeat the image of America leaving Vietnam, that they were not going to leave Afghanistan, as they put it, on the struts of helicopters off the top of their embassy roof. So they mounted a very brutal, one might say, campaign to make it look as though they were leaving in a peaceful, orderly fashion.
Yes, this operation probably is the best that I remember still, because I've never seen so many dead bodies in my life, so much blood in my life. Soviet troops were standing along the road in the south of Selang Pass in the mountains, and they launched early in the morning, January 23rd, 1989, a heavy attack. Ahmad Shah Massoud, a Mujahideen leader who supposedly was in that region, he pulled out and took all his forces out. So that attack was launched against peaceful villagers, men, women, children. They destroyed half of the mountains. They destroyed all the villages. They just killed all the people there. And basically it was called, you declare a victory and run.
We pulled out the Soviet troops not because they had suffered a defeat, but because the atmosphere that had developed throughout the world, we must sincerely acknowledge it was a legitimate development. And in that specific region, the atmosphere became such that we had to pull our troops out. And inside our own country, our young people were dying. It was a tragedy for these families.
The Soviet Union claimed that 15,000 of its soldiers were killed and another 35,000 wounded during 10 years of fighting the Mujahideen. The true figure may never be determined. The soldiers who survived returned home to find the Soviet Empire falling apart. Further, the new freedom of the press revealed the brutality of the Afghan war to a mass audience. These war stories were much less black and white than the glorious tales of World War II.
Well, I think that, first of all, someone who never was in Afghanistan doesn't understand what we're doing there in the first place. And you think, what were we doing there? What were we fighting for? Why did my friends die? No one knows why. You end up saying, because our leaders sent us in there, because of their political ambitions.
I was lucky to return alive. I knew that anything could happen to me and that they might bring me back in a zinc coffin, but I went there fully aware of that. And those who were left there, who returned in zinc coffins, they were our best guys. And we could have entirely resolved this problem through peaceful diplomatic means, without the use of force. But since it turned out this way, I consider that we carried out our duty, just like the American soldiers in Vietnam. They were ordered to go, and they did their duty. The politicians are to blame. They must be judged. But for some reason, now we are told that we are criminals, murderers. Well, excuse me, what kind of a criminal or murderer am I? I was sent there, I was ordered to go there, and so were my comrades, and so were the soldiers and officers in Vietnam. They were ordered to go. We took an oath, we had our regulations, and we had to submit. If we didn't submit, then what the devil kind of army would we have?
On February 15, 1989, the last Soviet troops pulled out of Afghanistan. They left behind a nation on the brink of civil war. Most observers thought the Mujahideen would overrun Kabul within a month. In fact, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan outlived the USSR. It took 3 years for Kabul to fall. Some feel the Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of the thousands of lives that sustained the Afghan war throughout the 80s. Certainly the distance between the communist ideal and the imperialist reality of the Afghan occupation had disillusioned hundreds of thousands of soldiers and their families. Ultimately, the war devastated two countries, Afghanistan and the Soviet Union.